is in clinical practice and has co-taught a course called Psychology of Parenting Adult Children, which she will be repeating to this group tonight in the OLLI program at American University. Also, most pertinent to the topic, Carol indicates that she's a wife, mother, stepmother, in-law, and grandparent. And parenthetically, may I add, it's not in her resume. She's also a wonderful, wonderful personal friend. So without further ado, Carol, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be able to talk with you. And let me start out with a personal example of what we're about to talk about. Some years ago, when my parents lived in Florida, I was sitting at National Airport waiting for a plane. And it was the summer, and lo and behold, there was a thunderstorm. And as you might expect, an announcement came across the loudspeakers at the airport. And what was said was that the plane would be delayed, not unexpected. And I was sitting next to a much older woman, and I looked to my left at her. And she looked at me and she said, "You know something? My kids are really going to screw this up." And I looked at her and I said, "Well, how old are they?" And she said 60 and 62. And this is an example of what we're about to talk about, that our children are always our children, even though they are adults. And as many of us have experienced, we have nostalgia of our relationships with our children from the past, what it was like to parent them when they were young, the enjoyment we had, the direction we felt that we could give to them. And yet what we have to also understand is that as adults, they have developed autonomy. And this is what we want for them. But along with that autonomy is that they are not open to seeing that they are childlike, or that they are childlike. And with that comes them not necessarily needing or wanting input on how they should behave, what their attitude should be, and how they should run their lives. So what I will focus on today is understanding the macro factors of cohort differences. What is important to us as we age, and also our thoughts about what successful engagement is in adulthood with our adult children. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about grandparenting. There are real differences between when most of us grew up and when our children have grown up. If you're a baby boomer, you were born between 1946 and 1964. And typically, our parents instilled in us the goals of economic security and stability, loyalty, and commitment that came from their own experiences in their own lives. For example, in my experience, I came from a family of German refugees, and my parents were very interested in me having security in my life and not having to worry. And so when I went off to college, they really instilled in me perhaps I should major in education or nursing, because that would provide me with security. I also was married for the first time at the age of 21. And that, I guess, influence was with me when I started college, but lo and behold, I happened to take a psychology course, and I lived on a floor where people were majoring in Italian and philosophy, and it kind of opened me up to other possibilities. But I still kept in mind what my parents had tried to educate me with in terms of life goals and what to expect and how to deal with it. So, with regard to the rest of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to be quiet for about a minute, and it might be interesting to just think about for a minute what you came to your adulthood with, having experienced your parents' tutelage, and then we'll go from there. So I will be quiet for about a minute, and just, you might want to jot down some notes or just think about it. Okay, you can keep kind of thinking about it as I talk some more. Um, Most often, especially in the early part of this period or in this cohort, men in families worked and women stayed home with their children. Getting married, excuse me, occurred significantly earlier in people's lives. On average, due to the non-availability of the kinds of birth control we now have, completing college, living independently, having a family, and owning a home were often the goals of that baby boomers instilled in their own children. And that if these goals were completed, it was an indication of a successful adulthood. Boomers were planful. They made plans to live, and often self-worth was characterized by a work ethic. The next cohort was a term Generation X, and I'm going through this because you may be reading these kinds of cohort names in newspapers and in research articles. Generation X encompassed people born between 1965 and 1979. It's also termed the latchkey generation because during this cohort, 40% of families had parents where both parents worked, and children after school would come home and lock their houses and fend for themselves until one of the parents, usually the mother, came home from work. Goals for this group that were passed to their children included economic security also, and stability, and completing college. This group, while being independent with their children, often emphasized family well-being, and it was sometimes surmised that this was as a compensation for having been a latchkey child. The next group, millennials, encompass people born between 1980 and 1996. And the oldest adult children in this group describe themselves as being of middle age. And often these are the children of the age that we have children. This group, in contrast to the two earlier groups, is characterized by frequent changes in goals and non-traditional paths. Their goals tend to be formed not by parent tutelage, but by life experience. And their goals are more varied and they tend to be more accepting. There's data that suggests that 60% of millennials, excuse me, have been in diverse relationships, if we, in part, define diversity in terms of culture, race, religion, sexual orientation. 8 to 10 millennials, the data suggests, sleep with their cell phones. They are less likely than their parents to have specific religious affiliation, and they wait longer to be married. Women in this group, on average, are more likely, except during COVID, to work outside the home and to be professionals. And then finally, the last generation we'll talk about is Generation Z. And these kids are born, excuse me, to late Gen X people and early millennials. And they have been born between 1997 and 2015. Of note, smartphones were developed in 2007 and were available to the public. And so they have been a big influence on millennials and on Gen Z children. The technology that came with smartphones informed a number of things in children of this cohort. They spend less time on homework. They date later and have sex later. They postpone driving. They are less likely to read for pleasure. There is a decline in external activity in this group, and it was more pronounced during COVID. There's a decline in self-satisfaction and in mental health indicators, informed in part by social comparison on social media. These children don't yet have long-term goals. And there has been an interesting recent article that emphasizes some of these spontaneity changes, in the sense it was written by recruiters who recruit young people for work. And they have indicated that talking about issues that might have appealed to boomers, even to millennials, about what happens when you progress in the organization and when you have long-term benefits and so forth, appeal not at all to these younger kids. What appeals is talking about what happens in the next 6 months, what the benefits are, what they can expect, what they can experience in the current frame. To operationalize all of these differences and to think about ourselves, what we may have to kind of realize in terms of our experience and their experience is that as boomers, we had to be planful. If we watched a TV show once a week and we missed the show, we missed it. We had hard copy of catalogs like the Macy catalog. We had a solitary phone sometimes hanging on a wall. I remember being in college and once a week getting a chance to call home from a hall telephone. That informed parents' expectations and children's expectations. There wasn't a lot of spontaneity. We had mimeograph machines. Young people now don't even really know what they are. And we didn't have PCs and iPads. I remember walking to a mainframe with boxes of computer cards. As compared to us, the later generation cohorts grew up binge streaming with Amazon, Spotify, Netflix, and they're used to spontaneity and look for instant gratification rather than planning way ahead. They often interact with friends virtually rather than going out and meeting them. Texting is often the preferred mode of communication, and we as parents often miss not talking more because it seems more engaging and intimate. Work goals, as I mentioned, are different. Longevity and loyalty are often not the goals. Sometimes young people quit if it doesn't feel like, even if they are not sure what comes next. In a recent study of 81%, and a recent study of millennials, 81% of that sample indicated that it was more important to them that their children have contentment rather than that they be hard striving to be at the top of their professions. So these different cohort differences may inform different views of what values should be, attitudes should be, and actually behavior. Goals that are important to us may not be as important to our adult children, given the cohort they grew up in and their own life experiences. So what constitutes parental well-being from an involvement with adult children? And how can we be sensitive to what is important for our adult children and important to them in terms of relationships? One thing that often is talked about is, for example, the case that parents of adult children often report that it is more important to them to have contact with their adult children than it seems in reverse for the children to have contact with them. In hearing from adult children about this, and for example, when we teach the course at Oli, we have a panel of adult children come in and talk to the class. What these adult children say they often wish that their parents understood is that they love and care for their parents, but that they have work and they have schedules and they have children to contend with, and that less engagement or need for engagement involves the multiple focuses, but does not mean a lack of care of and for their parents. Perhaps, this should be made explicit in conversation between parents and their adult children, but even if understood, it still can feel disappointing. But it helps to understand that it's not a matter of our value or our importance. Switching for a moment to the aging process, the research on happiness in later adulthood suggests that relationships, even more than wealth and accomplishment, seem particularly important as we age. Recently, and many of you may be familiar with this study, research from an 80-year study of Harvard graduates found that social effort and engaging in relationships were key to feelings of well-being in older adulthood. Now, this research, because it was from a long time ago and followed Harvard graduates, particularly was about men. However, there is other research on women that suggests that historical close relationships, even if we don't see those individuals very often, are key to feeling satisfied in older adulthood. And we can surmise that family relationships and them going well are key to a sense of completeness in older adults, especially to women. So the issue becomes, given that our adult children grew up in eras of perhaps different influences and different values, attitudes, and behavior and engagement between themselves and others, and with the spontaneity encouraged by technology, how do we make the best of our relationships with our adult children so it feels good to us and good to them, and we all feel like we are thriving, even though there may be different priorities? So let me back up a little bit and tell you about a personal experience that I had that has influenced a lot of my thinking because I think it's correct. Before my son and daughter-in-law had their first child, my cousin, who already had grandchildren, had a conversation with me. And she said, "Carol, you now have the opportunity to be Mrs. Fine." And I sort of was a bit puzzled. And I said, "What do you mean, Mrs. Fine?" And she said, "Well, you're going to see when your children have their baby, that they do some things with that child that make your hair stand on end. And you're going to smile and say, 'That's fine.'" And that may seem concrete and simplistic, but in fact, that encompasses a lot of what we might have to think about when we relate to our adult children. A number of criteria come to mind in terms of what might facilitate engagement and good feeling in relationships with our adult children. One of the most important issues, especially when there are disagreements or different views, to keep in mind, and I'm going to backtrack for 1 second and say, we all have to have our own goals of what we feel is important as we relate to our adult children. And this is also true in marriages and between couples, where what we have to decide is what is more important, to be right or to facilitate the relationship. And if our goal is to facilitate the relationship, we may have to think about some of the following issues to keep in mind. One very important issue with us and our children and or our adult children is validation, especially, as I said, when there are differences of opinion. And that comes up when there might be a request or there might be a negation, where what we have to do is to empathize and validate and then offer our perspective. And that doesn't mean we artificially agree. It's just letting know our adult children know that we are listening, we understand, and now we hope that we can explain our view on something. And we start the conversation with, "I understand you're saying X. I appreciate your view, and not but, I'd also like to tell you what I am thinking about this, and then maybe we can go from there. But it's the empathy and the validation and making the other person feel, in this case, the adult child, respected in terms of acknowledging that is important. You can also define in this conversation what you would like to have happen and throw it out as a possibility. Again, empathizing and understanding that the adult child might be busy, and you know how important it is to make the deadline, and on and on and on. And also hope that your view on this can be, in terms of coming for Thanksgiving or whatever it might be, understood. Another key issue, and this is hard, is not to be intrusive, especially giving advice when we're not asked for advice, because we may think we know, but we're dealing not with a 10-year-old, we're dealing with an adult who is living his or her own life. The other hard thing that we have to navigate with our adult children is not necessarily expecting reciprocity, even though we might wish for it, even though all the effort we have put into rearing the child and helping that child develop autonomy and success in adulthood. So that is another issue that emotionally we may have to deal with. And again, if the goal is to enhance the relationship, we may have to think about how we can be of value to the adult child and to the adult child's family, without an expectation of return necessarily. Can we take care of the kids so they can have a night out? Can we have a short dinner? Don't have to stay a long time. Would that help you out during the week? Those kinds of things. Again, and I'm just repeating, it may be important to stay away from hot points and intrusiveness, especially about issues like child rearing. This also may be more or less difficult given our own temperaments. If we feel more comfortable taking control and being directive, it may be a harder task to not give advice, to not be intrusive, if that is our temperament, rather than being somewhat easier, more flexible in style. The goal is not to make the adult child feel criticized, that they're not doing a good job, to be the support, to be there, and to make the child feel valued. So this, I hope I'm not oversimplifying this, but these are some key issues if the goal is to make the relationship work, even though we think we're right and even though we would like to step in. Now, just for a moment, and to talk about grandparenting, and if you do have grandchildren, it is, I'm making an assumption, probably important that you feel like you have access to them, that you have a relationship with them, that you can enjoy them. And given that we're living longer, our relationship with our grandchildren may be longer than what the case had been with our parents and our own children. So it usually is important for people to be able to have that access. And what the research literature tells us is that grandparent involvement is associated with grandparent satisfaction and well-being over time, that it is an important relationship. Now, the Harvard study, which was longitudinal, did not focus on grandparent relationships, again, probably because the study was done with men. But with multiple research findings, it can be inferred again that ongoing, excuse me, that ongoing relationships with people are very important to us, especially as we age, that it gives us vitality, it gives us a feeling of importance and belonging, and that is crucial for well-being as we age. The literature also suggests, as I mentioned before, that historical relationships are important. Now, what we know about the grandparent relationship is that more grandparent-child reaction is associated, as I mentioned, with more satisfaction. And we also know that grandmothers have significantly more solo interaction with grandchildren than grandfathers have solo interaction with grandchildren, although grandfathers often join grandmothers to participate with their grandchildren. Now, some of the grandparent issues mirror the issues of parents dealing with their adult children. Grandparents, says the literature, who set boundaries and are available, but are not directive or intrusive, have less conflictual relationships with their adult children and their spouses. That makes sense given the context. In general, cooler feelings towards daughters-in-law is linked to weaker ties with grandchildren, which accents the gatekeeper role of mothers with their children. So it's the mother in the family that may legislate how much interaction a grandparent has with their grandchildren. Grandmothers who only have sons, and I think this is really interesting, spend less time with their grandchildren and were less satisfied on average with relationship quality and their grandmother role than if these grandmothers who had daughters who had children. And often, if there are difficulties between a mother and the grandmother, it would be the son that would have to try and make amends or make it easier. Excuse me. Grandparent expressed psychological control, intrusiveness, directiveness, criticism about child rearing was associated with conflict, and that's not surprising. And so the recommendation is having easy conversations with the mothers, in particular, of the grandchildren. Often, and this shouldn't be surprising either, the relationship between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law is more limited during a week, especially in the same geographical location, as compared to mothers and their own daughters. If between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, there are similarities in terms of race, religion, culture, it is somewhat easier, interestingly enough. The other issue that I find interesting is that with the birth of a first child, a daughter-in-law becomes more involved with her own mother, even if she has had issues with her own mother in the past. So it is a little more challenging, even with a good relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, to maintain the same level of interaction. Again, what seems to be most important, according to the research, and which goes back to the comment of needing to be Mrs. Fine or Mr. Fine, is that having easy, enjoyable conversation and not being intrusive, especially about child rearing or giving advice that isn't asked for, seems key to the relationship ease and enjoyment between grandparent, parent, adult parent, and the grandchildren. So there seems to be thematic, how should I say, similarity between issues that involve relating to adult children and then relating to grandchildren via the adult children. And that's where I'll stop for today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. So you're stopping, but we're open for questions. So let me just, again, thank you. I appreciate the information. Certainly seems right compared to what I know about my children and what I've heard. But I look forward to hearing what others have to say. And Carol has graciously agreed to answer any questions we might have.
Or try to.
Or try to. So if you'd like to either put a question in the chat, or you're welcome to ask it yourself. Please remember you are muted. So you need to unmute and raise your hand either in person or electronically. And I'm happy to recognize you and give you the opportunity to ask your question. I see we have somebody on the phone. That's 202-290-1949. Did you have a question? No. Okay.
If it's me, no.
Okay. We remute that person. Were there any questions at all for Carol? Really? Nobody has any questions. Well, that's surprising. So I guess, Carol, I'll kind of throw one out just to get the ball rolling. So one of the questions I had listening to your talk, and you mentioned that the millennials and the new generation have different goals. In what way would you say these goals are different from the goals of their parents?
Again, I'm going to generalize,
Of course.
I would say they're more defined by the current frame, the current situation they're in, the current gratification they expect. Just in terms of, that loyalty and staying in the same job forever is not seen as necessarily success, whereas that might have been the planfulness and moving forward towards longevity and looking ahead were much more a part of boomer goals coming from their parents who might have been in the Depression, who may have fought in wars, who may have been immigrants and had to look forward and just couldn't say now, ever, that there was a real concern about security, safety, and the future.
And do you think those goals changed as a result of the recent pandemic?
Um, that's a good question. I don't know that the goals have changed. I think there has been frustration, there has been upset, uh, especially in terms of women who may have not been able to pursue their own forward orientation because of childcare issues that still, for in many families, seem to fall more to women. And so I think there is more frustration.
Interesting. Okay, we now have some questions. So, Judith, I'm going to call on you first and then Peggy.
Hi, Carol.
Hi.
You talked a little bit about what parents want from their adult children. And I guess I'm curious about what adult children want from their parents, especially millennial adult children. What are they looking for in the relationship?
I think that they are looking for appreciation, understanding, sometimes help, broadly defined, because I think a lot of millennials are having, again, maybe because of COVID, financial issues, support, but not looking for unasked for, again, I'm just repeating myself, advice. But I think the support, broadly defined, making life easier if there's geographical closeness, especially for women, are important issues for millennials.
Thank you.
Okay, Peggy, I'm going to ask you next, and then I think we have a question in the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have shared with Lynn the most horrible situation I have been enduring the last 6 years, and that has been, I have been totally frozen out of any communication, relationship, any contact at all with my grandchildren by first of all my daughter-in-law, and now recently by my daughter. And after a 10-year wonderful relationship with the grandchildren, I only would visit them a couple of times a year. They both told me that, you know, I was to follow their orders, which I did. And the orders became more and more strenuous, including finally the last 3 years I would come to visit, and I was only allowed to come for 48 hours. I was told not to bring presents because the kids would get too excited. The last time I was at my son's house, all the pictures of our family had been removed. I was looking for a ball in a closet, and I found a lot of Valentine cards and gifts I'd sent the kids all shoved in the back of the closet. They had not received them. And since they have now completely stopped communicating with me, I send little gifts, I send cards, and I have no idea if they receive them. And this has been going on now for 6 years. The kids are now teenagers. This is called alienation. I finally started doing research, and there is a national organization called Alienated Grandparents Anonymous. And it's a growing crisis, really. I think it's because so many, and it's almost always initiated by the woman, almost always a daughter-in-law, but sometimes the daughter, incredibly insecure, incredibly threatened by anything that I think threatens her relationship with particularly her male children and her husband, and our, which means my son. And my son is kind of in a Swedish Stockholm, syndrome there. He's been threatened that, she will leave him if he's been told he has to choose between his mother and his family. And in that case, and this is a lot in the alienated grandparents. I don't know if you have come across this, but I'm really getting tired of hearing therapists who say it's the parents who have to listen to the children and be understanding and all. I have begged my children for 6 years to tell me what I possibly could have done to have this situation happen, where suddenly I am not allowed in any way to contact with my grandchildren, and they are just silent. They would not even recognize my 80th birthday, my 82nd birthday. I mean, what child would not, what son, what daughter would not recognize their mother's and her identical twin sister, by the way, who's loved them, their 80th birthday. They celebrated our 75th. And I really don't know. There is no one to turn to. I've asked my son's rabbi, I've asked the church people, and they go, oh, this is way beyond my pay scale. We need therapists who realize it isn't always, in fact, in this case, it is not the parents' fault. There's something terribly, terribly going wrong. I have beaten myself up trying to figure out what I did wrong. I am tired of every time I think of, oh, maybe it was that. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe we shouldn't have gone to Europe. Maybe, I can't keep doing that. I would love to be able to talk to them or not talk to them. Let's just move on. All I want is a relationship with my grandchildren. And there's no one to go to for help with that. No one. So I'm asking your therapist to help, to give some ideas. What can you do if you're completely and utterly canceled? And that's what this is.
It sounds like you have tried everything you could do. And I don't mean to be evasive or not helpful, but it sounds like there's no availability on their part. And it isn't always the parents' fault. It sounds like you have tried to go over your history. You've taken responsibility for what you can take responsibility for. But it sounds like there's no way to get them to listen or to be available or to even consider. And it sounds like sometimes the suggestion is to do it more indirectly with email or writing a letter, and it doesn't help.
Tried all of that.
Yeah.
And it's a growing problem. I think the therapeutic community needs to start understanding it isn't the parents' fault. That I think our daughters-in-law are in big trouble right now, and they're terribly stressed out. And I think they need help, and our grandchildren, because the grandchildren are being denied an incredibly important relationship that could have helped so much the last 3 years. I don't know whether to write about it. I'm a journalist. I want to write, but I don't want to hurt the kids. I don't want them identified. I don't want their jobs being hurt, but somehow we've got to get it out that this is going on. And it's not a lack of listening by the parents. I would die to listen. I would.
Sure. No, and you're believable. It's so wounding that, and it's a mystery of what happened.
It is.
Right?
It is.
It is a hard situation, I think, for all concerned, both the parents, the children, and the grandchildren. And I think, it's an unfortunate situation. I don't think there's easy answers.
No.
I wish we could get an easy answer during a Zoom presentation, but I don't think that's fair to Carol.
Well, it just sounds like there's no opening on their part at this point. And
well, I wish there was some
Carol,
societal thing that would say, what? You can't do that. At least, give your mother a birthday card. Isn't there somewhere in society where because they're involved in church, they're involved in school. I think they're really good parents. But, to show their children that if something's wrong, you just cancel somebody. Surely there must be somewhere in schools and churches and school activities, where can I send a birthday present where the kids can get it and answer and thank me and not be afraid to thank me. There must be,
Wait
maybe
till they go to college.
There you go.
it's,
Peggy, I hear you, and
I know. Thank you,
I
Lynn,
know
for
you.
letting me.
No, no
I want to
problem.
put this
no
out.
problem.
I want people to know about it. And I thank you. And I wondered what if you had heard about alienation. This is not estrangement. This is way beyond estrangement.
And I guess the question, Carol, really is this a precedent going on? Is this something kind of a new wave of parenting? I guess that's really kind of what we're trying to understand.
Yeah.
I have seen therapists who said, dump your parents if you feel like they didn't give you enough love when you were children, you know.
I hope that's not what's being said. And I don't know the data, or if there is data on how frequently this happens, but it does sometimes happen. I just don't know the prevalence. And go ahead.
Thank you. No, that's okay. I just wanted to move on. I am conscious of
Right.
your
Thank
time.
you.
And I
Thank
did
you, Lynn.
promise
Thank
that
you.
we would, not keep you all night. So in the chat, Carol Kelly writes, it was a wonderful presentation. She's done some work on generations and feels you're right on target. She was wondering if you could give further examples about how to diffuse difficult situations, and Peggy, this kind of approaches what you were talking as well. But Carol's asking between mothers and daughter-in-laws, is there any advice you have for people who are having, who find that the difficult situation, how to diffuse that type of thing?
Well, as I said, what I tend to sort of go to the research literature, and one possibility is if there's a good relationship with the son may be able to understand both points of view and modulate a bit. The other thing is, and it depends on the temperament of the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law, to just acknowledge that it is difficult or that there is a difficulty, and to try to understand from, let's say, the daughter's-in-law point of view, what it is that the mother-in-law might be doing to make it difficult, and really reach out and say, that she does want to understand, because the daughter-in-law is important, as are the children. So, and that may be a first try, but the son often is seen as a help in terms of trying to convey to the mother or to the wife, if she's open to it, that there may be difficulty in asking what can be done, and that it's not a loyalty issue to the wife.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I'm not seeing any other hands up or anything in the chat. Carol, thank you so much. This was really an excellent, I stand corrected. Judith, I see a hand.
I know you're recording this. Will we be able to get a recording?
So the recording gets, yes, thank you for pointing that out. The recording gets posted on our website, gets posted on our YouTube channel. There is a link to the YouTube channel on our website, and you can follow Georgetown Village on YouTube for get notified when we update new recordings. We usually update the recording probably sometime next week once we get it from Zoom and make sure it's clear. And all of our past CCC programs are recorded as well. So please feel free to watch it, to send your friends. We're happy to share this wonderful resource with you. So thank you for asking.
Thank you.
I guess at this point, I don't see other questions. So thank you very much, Carol. This was really an excellent, excellent presentation. As a parent of millennials, I could tell you that it certainly struck home, and I heard a lot of things that sounded familiar, including the texting, not talking. But I really appreciate it, and it's good to know I'm not alone on that. And so have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you, and be sure to tune in for our next program. We offer these programs once a month, and I encourage you to join us. So have a nice evening, and thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye.